So let's continue working on the backend of authentication. And for this, back here in our code, we of course want to start by taking a look at the auth controller. Here we have the get signup function for serving that signup page. But of course, in order to handle the submission of this form, we now also want to add a new function, maybe right below it, though the exact position doesn't matter, which could be called signup. The name is up to you, but you typically want to describe what's happening when this function is called. And this should be a function, a controller action that will be executed when a user is created, when a user signs up. Here, of course, we still get request and response because we still have a middleware function here in the end. And I want to expose that outside of this file, so I'll make it available under a key named signup in my exported object. Now I'll come back to this function in a second. For the moment, I want to go to my routes, to the auth routes, and add a new route here for handling this. Now this will not be a get route because I don't want to handle a get request. Instead, it is quite common to use post requests for things like signing up users. Basically, whenever you create data on the server, whenever you manipulate data on the server, you want to use a post request instead of a get request. So therefore here I'll define a post route. The path can still be signup though. And it's okay to have two routes with the same path as long as they have different HTTP methods they handle. And here I then point at auth controller signup, which is this newly added function I added a couple of seconds ago. Now, of course, we need to ensure that such a post request to /signup is being sent when the form is submitted. And therefore, in our signup.ejs file where we have the form, we now need to set the action and method of that form. Because with the action, we control where a request is sent to automatically by the browser. With method, we define which kind of request is sent. Now the where is /signup, and this ensures that we simply target our current domain /signup. The method for forms has to be get or post, and as mentioned a couple of seconds ago, we typically want to go for post. This also has the advantage that post requests, unlike get requests, can have a post body, a request body, which can contain extra data which you want to submit. With get requests, we can also submit data with help of query parameters, as you saw before in the course, but this is less common and simply not recommended when you are about to store data on the backend. So post it is. Now with that, this signup.ejs file is properly configured, the route was added. Now we just have to work on that controller. And in this controller function, the signup function, I now of course want to in the end validate all the incoming user data, see if it's correct and if we maybe already have a user with that email. And ultimately, if we made it through all the validation, I want to create a user and store that user in a database. And that's the keyword, database. Before we start writing any logic here, we want to make sure that we're able to connect to a database. And you can, of course, build this kind of website with both a SQL-based database like MySQL or a NoSQL database like MongoDB. I will go for MongoDB here because it's a bit closer to JavaScript syntax-wise, which can make it a bit easier to work with, and we've been working with it a lot throughout the course, so we probably got more practice with it. Nonetheless, definitely feel free to also build a version of this project where you use SQL and MySQL instead. Both will work. Now you want to ensure that you got MongoDB installed to continue. And of course, we did install it earlier in the course. If you skipped those sections, I do recommend that you go through them. You want to install the community server in the end. So even if you don't go through these sections, you can of course also install it with help of the official docs, where you can also learn how to install MongoDB on different operating systems. It's the community edition which we need. Once you did install it, you also need to start it. You learned about that earlier in the course, and you also find instructions on this here in the official docs. And once you started it, here I have it running in a separate terminal window, we are ready to connect to it. Now for connecting to it and for managing a pool of connections, I will create a separate file, and actually a separate folder, which I'll name data or database, in which I'll add a database.js file. And this file will hold the logic for connecting to MongoDB. However, I still don't want to write all the logic on my own. I instead will install a third-party package, which we have also used a lot in this course, the MongoDB package, which helps us with establishing and managing that connection. So npm install MongoDB. And once that is installed, in this newly added database.js file, we can import MongoDB by requiring it in there. And this MongoDB package will give us a lot of utility methods that make working with a database easier. Because here, with that required now, as a next step, I will create a Mongo client by using mongodb.mongoClient, Mongo client like this. And then we can use this Mongo client to call the connect static method on it. So we don't need to instantiate Mongo client. We can call connect on it like this. And connect then takes the URL to our database. And with a locally installed MongoDB database server, that is localhost 27017. That's the default port occupied by the MongoDB server. Now connect returns a promise, and you learned about promises. These are objects which will eventually resolve to a certain value, and they are often used in situations where you have an asynchronous operation, so an operation which may take a bit longer and which therefore runs side by side with your other code and which eventually then completes. And we can handle such promises with help of the then method, which we can call on the promise object, or a bit more convenient with async await. For this we just need a separate function, which I would need anyways here though, which could be called connect to database. And this function can be decorated with the async keyword. This then unlocks the await keyword inside of this function. And now if I call Mongo client connect inside of this function, we can await this. And what we'll get back is a client object which has internal information about the established connection. Now I want to use this client in various places of my project here, and hence I'll add a database variable, which initially is undefined, and in the end, in this database variable, I'll store client.db, which is a built-in method which we can call on this client object to connect to a certain database. And here I'll choose online shop as a database name. As you learned in this course, when working with MongoDB, you don't have to create databases ahead of time. Instead, you can simply use any database of your choice, and it will be created for you the first time you enter data if it doesn't exist yet. And it's then the connection to this concrete database which is stored in this database variable. And I'm using this variable because I'll add a second function, getDB, where I actually will check if we maybe don't have a database yet, in which case I'll generate a custom error. We can throw such an error with the throw keyword, and that will crash the application then, or at least generate an error, which we can handle in some other place if we try to access the database without connecting to it first, which shouldn't happen here, but which could happen. And I'll create a new error object with new error using the built-in error class or constructor function, which is built into JavaScript, to generate an error object and to then throw this generated error object. And to this error constructor function, you can pass an error message string, like you must connect first. So now that's an error I will throw if we try to get access to the database without establishing the connection first. If we make it past this if check, which we normally should, I will return a handle to that database. And then ultimately, I want access to these functions from outside this file, so I will export an object which has a pointer at connect to database, using connect to database as a key, and which has a pointer to getDB, using getDB as a key. So that's my database.js file. This database.js file will now be used in my app.js file, because there I want to establish a connection to the database right when I'm starting my web server. And I don't want to start my web server if establishing that database connection failed. So here in app.js, we can start by importing this database object by requiring ./data/database. And then here at the bottom where I call app listen, I will now simply call db connect to database. And this then yields a promise, simply because in database.js, connect to database is an async function, and any function decorated with async will automatically always yield a promise, even if you don't return a promise yourself. I don't have any return statement in there. Nonetheless, async functions will always return a promise automatically. And therefore in app.js, where I call connect to database, this will yield a promise. And then here we can add then to execute code if that promise succeeded, or catch if that promise failed, if we had an error in there, for example. And we could get an error if connecting to the database fails. Now in that error case, I'll define an anonymous function which gets that error object, which is generated automatically by the MongoDB package if establishing the connection failed. And then I'll just console log failed to connect to the database. And after that, I'll also console log the error object so that we can see more details about the error as well. Now in the then case that we succeeded, here I actually will also define an anonymous function, and in here I just want to call app listen 3000, so this code down there, to only start up the web server and start listening on port 3000 if we connected to the database successfully. With that, we should be establishing a database connection whenever we start this server. So now, since I shut down the server before anyways, in order to install the MongoDB package, we can restart it with npm start, and it crashes here for me. Invalid connection string, and yes, the reason is a mistake in database.js in this URL. The correct URL to a locally installed MongoDB database is localhost 27017, but we have to prefix this with MongoDB://. That's the actual URL the MongoDB package wants. So if we now save this, this now restarts, and now we have that running server which is connected to a database.